the summer that the sky forgot how to rain. Charlotte Hawkins watched her neighbors' fields turn to bone-colored dust, while her own 7 acres of corn stood green and tall against a horizon the color of ash. And folks began riding for miles just to see if what they heard was true. It was the summer of 1878, in a stretch of western Kansas that the railroad surveyors had once called promising, and the settlers who came after had come to call cursed. The county was named Larkspur, though no larkspur had bloomed there in 3 years, and the town at its center, Millbrook, had shrunk from 400 souls to just over 200 as families packed their wagons and turned back east, defeated by a drought that had lasted longer than any living person could remember. Charlotte Hawkins was 26 years old and had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Thomas Hawkins, had died of a fever that swept through the county the previous spring, leaving her alone on 160 acres of homestead land with a soddy house, 2 mules, a milk cow, and a debt to the bank in Millbrook that grew heavier each month like a stone she could not set down. Everyone had expected her to sell out and go home to her people in Missouri. Instead, she had planted corn. It made no sense to anyone who watched her do it. The other farmers in Larkspur County had given up on corn 2 seasons back, switching to sorghum or simply letting their fields lie fallow and praying for rain that did not come. But Thomas had dug a well the autumn before he died, deeper than any other well in the county, striking an underground spring that fed a slow but steady flow of water into a stone cistern behind the house. Charlotte had spent that whole spring, alone, hauling buckets from the cistern to the furrows before dawn and after dusk, working until her hands bled and her back screamed, because it was the only thing Thomas had left her besides grief, and she was not about to let it die in the ground. By July, when the rest of the county's crops had withered to brown stalks that crackled underfoot like paper, Charlotte's cornfield stood shoulder-high and green as a Missouri summer, a single square of impossible color in a world gone the color of dried blood and old bone. That was when Peter Walden rode into her life, though neither of them knew it yet. He came from the south, following the old cattle trail that cut through the corner of Larkspur County on its way toward the railhead at Dodge City, driving 11 head of longhorn cattle that were all he had left of a herd that had started at 200. The drought had killed the rest, or the drought and bad luck, and a stampede outside of no man's land that had scattered half his cattle into a ravine. Peter Walden was 31 years old, a cowboy who had ridden for outfits from Texas to the Dakota Territory, and he had never in 8 years of trail driving seen a summer as merciless as this one. He first saw the cornfield from a rise about 2 miles off, and he thought at first that the heat was playing tricks on his eyes, the way it sometimes did on long stretches of empty plain, throwing up mirages of water that vanished the closer a man rode toward them. But this did not vanish. The green only grew more solid, more real, as he came closer, until he was sitting his horse at the edge of a rail fence looking at a cornfield so lush it seemed to belong to another world entirely. "Well, I'll be," he said aloud, to no one but his horse and the 11 tired cattle strung out behind him on a lead rope. "Would you look at that?" He found the source of the miracle a few minutes later, when he rode along the fence line and came upon a woman standing at the edge of the field with a hoe in her hands, wearing a sun-bleached bonnet and a dress that had been mended so many times the original color was hard to guess at. She turned when she heard his horse, and he saw that she was young, younger than he had expected, with a face that had been made hard and watchful by grief and work, but that still held something soft underneath, like a fire banked but not gone out. "That's close enough," she said, before he had said a word, and he saw then that she held a shotgun leaned against the fence post within easy reach of her hand. "State your business." "Name's Peter Walden," he said, tipping his hat but staying mounted, his hands where she could see them. "I'm driving cattle north to Dodge City. Didn't mean to trespass, ma'am. I just never seen corn like that in a county this dry. Thought maybe I was seeing things. "You're not seeing things." Her voice was flat, guarded. "It's my well, deep one. My husband dug it before he died. I'm sorry for your loss. Everyone is." She said it without bitterness, just tired fact, the way a person says a thing they have said too many times already. "What do you want, Mr. Walden?" Peter looked past her at the corn, green and rustling faintly in a hot wind that carried no moisture in it at all. And then he looked at his cattle, ribs showing through their hides, tongues swollen from thirst, and he swallowed his pride because a man traveling with dying animals did not have much pride left to swallow anyway. "I'll be honest with you, ma'am. My cattle haven't had a good drink in 2 days. I passed 3 creek beds since Comanche County, and every one of them was dry as a preacher's sermon. I don't have much money, but I've got a strong back, and I know cattle and horses, and I know a bit about wells too, having dug 2 of them myself. If you'd let me water my herd, I'd work a day for you in trade. Whatever needs doing." Charlotte studied him for a long moment. She had learned in the past 14 months that men who came around a widow's homestead often had more on their minds than honest trade, and she had learned to read the look in a man's eyes before he had said more than a few words. What she saw in Peter Walden's eyes was exhaustion, plain and simple, and something else besides, a kind of quiet decency that she was not sure she trusted only because she had not seen much of it lately. "There's a stock tank behind the barn," she said finally, "fed by the same spring. You can water your cattle there, and I could use a hand fixing the fence on the east side if you're truly willing to work for it." "I am." "Then get down off that horse, Mr. Walden, and let's see if you're as good as your word." He was. Charlotte watched him from the corner of her eye all that afternoon as he worked the east fence line, replacing rotted posts with new ones cut from a stand of cottonwood that grew along the dry creek bed, stringing wire taut and true, working with the easy competence of a man who had done such labor 1,000 times before and took no shortcuts even when no one was watching to see if he did. He did not try to make conversation with her beyond what was necessary. He did not stare at her in the way some men did, in the way that made her skin crawl and her hand drift toward the shotgun. He simply worked, and when the sun began to sink low and orange over the flat horizon, he came to find her at the well, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana gone gray from dust. "Fence is done, ma'am. Ought to hold through winter now." "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "You're welcome to camp by the creek bed tonight if you want. There's a bit of shade there still, even dry as it is. I can spare some beans and cornbread for your supper, seeing as you worked an honest day. I'd be obliged." He looked at her a moment, and something in his face softened, though he did not let it linger there long enough to seem forward. "You didn't have to do any of this, ma'am. Water my cattle, feed a stranger. Most folks around here, I've noticed, are holding what little they have real close to the chest this year." "Most folks around here have good reason to," Charlotte said. "But I was raised believing a person shows kindness to a stranger not because they've got plenty, but because kindness is the one thing that doesn't run dry, even in a drought. My mother used to say that. I don't always believe it these days, but I try to live like I do." Peter Walden looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them that neither of them had a name for yet, something like recognition, like 2 people who had both been carrying a weight alone for a long time suddenly realizing the weight might be shared. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said. "She was. She passed 3 years back before I ever came out here." Charlotte turned back toward the house, and over her shoulder she said, "Supper's at sundown. There's a wash basin by the door if you want to clean up first." That evening, sitting at Charlotte's small table inside the soddy house with a bowl of beans and a slice of cornbread that had come from corn saved from the previous year's harvest, Peter Walden felt something he had not felt in a very long time on the trail. The strange, warm sensation of being somewhere that might, under different circumstances, be called home. He did not say this to Charlotte. He simply ate his supper and thanked her twice for it. And when she asked him about his cattle drive, about where he had come from and where he was headed, he told her plainly, without embellishment, about the herd he had lost outside of no man's land, About the 8 years he had spent riding for other men's outfits. About his dream, half-formed and rarely spoken aloud, of one day owning enough land and enough cattle to call himself something other than a hired hand. "Dodge City's still 3 days' ride from here," Charlotte said. "Your cattle look thin. Might be worth resting them a day or two before you push on." "Might be." Peter looked down at his empty bowl. "Though I don't like to impose on your hospitality more than I already have, ma'am." "You worked for your supper and your water," Charlotte said. "If you want to work another day for another night's rest, I won't turn away the help. There's more fence needs mending, and the barn roof has a leak that'll be trouble come the fall rains, if we ever get any." And so it was decided, simply and without much fuss, that Peter Walden would stay another day, and then another. And by the end of the week the cattle had regained some of the flesh on their bones, and Charlotte's barn roof no longer leaked, and the fence around her 160 acres stood straight and true from end to end. And neither of them had spoken a single word about what was happening between them, though both of them felt it, quiet and steady as the spring water flowing beneath Charlotte's land. The trouble started, as trouble in Larkspur County often did that summer, over water. Word of Charlotte's green cornfield had spread through the county, the way news always spread in places where there was little else to talk about, passed from farmhouse to farmhouse, exaggerated a little with each telling, until by the time it reached the ranch of Silas Grady, the richest and most powerful man in Larkspur County, the story had grown to suggest that the widow Hawkins was sitting on a veritable lake of water while the rest of the county baked and starved. Silas Grady owned 8,000 acres of range land to the south of Millbrook, cattle numbering in the thousands, and an influence over the county that extended into the bank, the sheriff's office, and the county commission. He had lost cattle that summer too, though not as many as smaller ranchers, and he had grown desperate enough and greedy enough to believe that a widow with no husband to protect her interests might be persuaded, one way or another, to share what she had, or better yet, to sell her land outright at a price far below its worth. He rode out to Charlotte's homestead on a Sunday afternoon in late July, accompanied by 2 of his hired men, and found Charlotte and Peter Walden together in the cornfield, checking the ears of corn for the first signs of ripeness. Peter had been at the homestead nearly 3 weeks by then, his cattle fully recovered, though he had found reason after reason to delay his departure for Dodge City, and Charlotte had found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, glad of every excuse he found. "Mrs. Hawkins," Silas Grady said, tipping his hat with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. He was a heavy-set man of perhaps 50 years, with a gray mustache waxed into sharp points and a way of looking at a person that made them feel measured and found wanting. "I heard remarkable things about this field of yours. Now I see they were true, and then some." "Mr. Grady," Charlotte's voice was polite but cool. "What brings you out this far from your own land?" "Business, Mrs. Hawkins, and neighborly concern." Grady dismounted, his 2 hired men remaining on their horses, and walked to the edge of the cornfield, running a hand over one of the tall green stalks as though inspecting merchandise. "The whole county's suffering something terrible this year. Cattle dying, crops failed, families packing up and leaving for good. And here you are, a widow woman alone, sitting on a spring that could ease the suffering of half the ranches in this county, if it were properly shared. The spring is on my land, Mr. Grady, under land my husband paid for and proved up honestly through the Homestead Act. I don't recall any obligation to share it. No legal obligation, perhaps." Grady smiled, though it did not warm his face at all. "But there's such a thing as Christian charity, Mrs. Hawkins, and there's such a thing as good sense, too. A woman alone out here, no husband, no sons to help her work the land or defend it. These are uncertain times. Desperate men do desperate things when their cattle are dying and their children are going hungry. I would hate to see harm come to a woman in your position, when a simple arrangement might spare you a great deal of trouble." Peter Walden had been standing a few feet back, saying nothing, but at this he stepped forward, placing himself, without seeming to make any particular point of it, between Charlotte and Silas Grady. "What sort of arrangement did you have in mind, Mr. Grady?" Grady looked Peter up and down, taking in his trail-worn clothes, the well-used pistol at his hip, the cattle grazing at the edge of the property. "And who might you be?" "Peter Walden. I've been helping Mrs. Hawkins with her land." "Have you now?" Something calculating moved behind Grady's eyes. "Well, Mr. Walden, this is a matter between myself and Mrs. Hawkins, as it concerns her property and the good of this county. Mrs. Hawkins asked me to help work this land," Peter said evenly, "and I intend to keep helping her, so I reckon that makes it my business too, at least so far as her safety is concerned. Now you said something about desperate men doing desperate things. Was that meant as information, Mr. Grady, or as a threat?" The air between the two men grew taut as a stretched wire. Grady's two hired hands shifted in their saddles, hands drifting a little closer to the guns at their hips, and for a moment Charlotte felt her heart pounding hard enough that she was sure everyone present could hear it. But Peter did not move, did not reach for his own weapon, only stood there steady and calm, his eyes fixed on Grady's face with an intensity that made the older man look away first. "It was meant as neighborly concern," Grady said at last, his voice tight. "Nothing more. But I'll say this plainly, since plain speaking seems to be what's wanted here. This drought is not going to break any time soon. The county commission is meeting next month to discuss water rights for the whole region, and there's talk of declaring certain wells and springs to be shared resources, for the good of the community, particularly wells dug on land that borders creek beds feeding into the larger watershed. It would go easier for you, Mrs. Hawkins, if you were seen to be cooperative before that meeting rather than defiant." "Is that a fact?" Charlotte said. "Or is that something you mean to arrange yourself through your friends on the commission?" Grady's jaw tightened. "I have said what I came to say. Good day, Mrs. Hawkins, Mr. Walden." He mounted his horse with the stiff dignity of a man who has not gotten what he wanted, and rode off with his two hired hands trailing behind him, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the still, hot air. Charlotte let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "That man has wanted this land since before Thomas died. He offered to buy us out twice back when Thomas was still living, always at a price that would have left us with nothing after paying off the bank. He's not going to let this go," Peter said, watching the retreating riders. "Man like that doesn't ride 2 hours out of his way for neighborly talk. No." Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself, though the day was hot enough that the gesture had nothing to do with cold. "He won't. And I don't know what to do about it, Peter. I don't have money for lawyers, and half the county commission owes Grady money or favors. If they declare my well a shared resource, I could lose everything, my corn, my water, all of it, right at harvest, right when I need it most." It was the first time she had used his given name instead of calling him Mr. Walden, and something in the sound of it, spoken with such raw worry, settled deep into Peter's chest and stayed there. "I'm not going to let that happen," he said, and he meant it with a certainty that surprised even himself, a certainty that had nothing to do with cattle drives or trail wages or any of the plans he had been carrying west toward Dodge City. "I don't know exactly how yet, but I'm not going to let that happen, Charlotte." It was the first time he had used her given name, too, and neither of them commented on it, though both of them felt the small, quiet shift it marked between them, like a fence post set finally true after a long, crooked line. Over the following days, Peter found himself thinking less and less about Dodge City and the cattle waiting to be sold there, and more about the woman whose land he had wandered onto by chance, whose green cornfield had drawn him in like a beacon in a wasteland. He told himself at first that he stayed because he had given his word about protecting her from Grady, and that was true enough. But it was not the whole truth, and he knew it every evening when Charlotte would come find him after the day's work was done, bringing coffee she had traded for eggs at the general store in Millbrook, and they would sit together on the porch of the soddy house watching the sun go down in colors of orange and violet over the dry, dust-blown plains, and talk about everything and nothing, and Peter would feel something inside himself settling into place that had never quite settled anywhere before. Charlotte, for her part, found herself watching for him in the mornings, listening for the particular rhythm of his footsteps as he came from the small lean-to he had built for himself near the barn, feeling a lightness in her chest when she saw him that she had not felt in longer than she cared to admit, not even in the last months of her marriage to Thomas, when the fever that would eventually take him had already begun to steal his strength and his laughter both. She felt guilty about this lightness sometimes, guilty in the particular way a widow feels guilty about being glad of anything, as though joy itself were a kind of betrayal of the dead. But Thomas had been a kind man, and she thought, in her quieter moments, that he would not have wanted her to spend the rest of her life alone in mourning, would not have wanted the corn he had made possible with his last labor on earth to be the only living, growing thing in her world. One evening in early August, as the two of them sat on the porch watching heat lightning flicker without rain far off on the southern horizon, Charlotte finally asked the question that had been sitting unspoken between them for weeks. "Why haven't you gone on to Dodge City, Peter? Your cattle have been fit to travel for 2 weeks now. You could have sold them and had money in your pocket already." Peter was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I've been asking myself that same question," he admitted. "I think the honest answer is that I don't much want to leave." "Why not?" "You know why not, Charlotte." His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man laying down cards he was not entirely sure he was ready to show. "I've been riding trails for other men's cattle for 8 years. Never had a place that felt like mine, never had much reason to want to stop moving. Then I rode up on this green field in the middle of all this dust and dying, and I found the strongest, bravest woman I ever met, working herself half to death to keep something alive that mattered to her, and I haven't been able to think about anything else since." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. "Peter, I know it's too soon to be saying such things," he went on before she could finish, his words coming faster now, as though he had been holding them back so long they were spilling out despite himself. "I know you lost your husband less than 2 years back, and I know grief doesn't work on any kind of schedule a man can plan around. I'm not asking you for anything, Charlotte. I just wanted you to know why I'm still here, in case you'd wondered, and in case it means anything to you at all." Charlotte looked out at the cornfield, dark now in the fading light, still and green and alive in a world that had gone brittle and brown all around it, and she thought of Thomas, and of the well he had dug with his own hands in the last months of his life, as though some part of him had known he would not be there to see what it would grow. And she thought that perhaps this was not a betrayal after all, but a kind of continuation, water finding its way to new growth the way it always eventually did, if given the chance. "It means something to me," she said quietly. "It means a great deal to me, Peter. I've been afraid to say so because it still feels strange to want something for myself again after everything. But I do want this. I want you to stay." Peter reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, and neither of them said anything more for a long while, content simply to sit together in the deepening dark, listening to the wind move through the dry grass and the corn, watching the distant lightning that promised rain it never quite delivered. The county commission meeting was set for the second Saturday of August, held in the largest room available in Millbrook, which was the meeting hall above the general store, a room that could barely hold 50 people, but that filled to capacity and beyond that Saturday, as word had spread through the county that the matter of water rights, and specifically the matter of the widow Hawkins's well, would be discussed and possibly decided. Charlotte arrived with Peter at her side, dressed in her best dress, a dark blue calico that had belonged to her mother, her hair pinned neatly beneath a straw bonnet, her back straight despite the fear that sat heavy in her stomach. She had spent the 2 weeks since Sela's Grady's visit trying to think of some way to protect her land, and had finally settled on the only strategy available to her: to appeal directly to the commission and to the community, with plain truth and reason, since she had neither money nor influence to offer as leverage. The meeting room was hot and close, crowded with farmers and ranchers whose faces were lined with the particular exhaustion of men and women who had watched a full year's hopes wither in the fields, whose children had gone half-fed through a long, dry summer, whose futures had narrowed down to the single desperate question of whether the rains would ever return. Charlotte understood their desperation. She had lived it herself, but she also understood, with a clarity that steadied her nerves as she took her seat near the front of the room, that giving away the one thing that had kept her own hope alive would not fix the desperation of the county, only spread her own ruin around to match everyone else's. Judge Elias Thornton, who served as chairman of the county commission, called the meeting to order, and after several matters of lesser importance had been dispatched, he came at last to the matter that had drawn such an unusual crowd. "The commission has received a proposal," Judge Thornton announced, reading from a paper in his hand, "put forward by Mr. Silas Grady and seconded by several other landowners, that in light of the severe drought conditions affecting Larkspur County, certain wells and water sources of unusual productivity be designated as shared community resources, to be administered by the Commission for the equitable benefit of all residents. The proposal specifically names the well located on the homestead of the widow Charlotte Hawkins as an example of such a resource." A murmur ran through the crowded room. Charlotte felt Peter's hand find hers beneath the folds of her skirt, steady and warm, and she drew strength from it as she rose to her feet when Judge Thornton, following procedure, asked if the affected party wished to speak. "I do, Your Honor." Charlotte's voice trembled slightly at first but grew steadier as she spoke. "I understand the suffering in this county. I have lived it myself, same as everyone here. I lost my husband to fever last year, and I have worked this land alone since, with my own 2 hands, hauling water bucket by bucket before that well was even dug deep enough to flow freely on its own. My husband, Thomas Hawkins, spent the last months of his life digging that well deeper than any other in this county, because he believed, even as he was dying, that it might be the thing that saved our farm. It is not some accident of fortune that my field is green this summer. It is the result of his labor and my labor since, and I do not believe it is right or lawful for this commission to take from me the one thing my husband left me, simply because I have had the fortune and the sweat to make good use of it. With respect, Mrs. Hawkins," came a voice from the crowd, one of the smaller farmers whose own field had failed entirely. "Some of us have children going hungry this winter if we don't find some way to feed our stock and grow something in the spring. It's easy to talk of what's rightfully yours when your family isn't the one starving." "I understand that, Mr. Aldous," Charlotte said, recognizing the speaker as a neighbor she had known since arriving in the county, a man with 5 children and a wife who had grown thin with worry over the summer. "I do understand it truly, but taking my well by force of this commission's vote will not make it rain on your fields. It will only ruin 2 families instead of 1, mine included, since my corn is bought and paid for entirely by that water, and if it's spread thin across a dozen farms, there won't be enough left to save any single crop, mine or anyone else's. I have another proposal if the commission will hear it." Judge Thornton, looking somewhat relieved to have an alternative presented, nodded for her to continue. "My well produces more water than my 7 acres of corn can use," Charlotte said. "I have known this for some weeks now, since the spring feeding it has proven stronger than even my late husband expected. I am willing, freely and of my own choice, to share what surplus water I have, through a system of hauling and fair distribution that I would help organize myself, with families in the greatest need, particularly for drinking water, and for keeping breeding stock alive through the worst of the drought. But I will not agree to have my well-declared common property taken from me by vote without compensation, when I am already willing to share its surplus freely as a neighbor, Out of the same charity I would hope others would show me if our positions were reversed. The room fell into a buzz of conversation, and for a long moment Charlotte could not tell which way sentiment was turning. Then Peter Walden rose from his seat beside her, and though he was a newcomer to the county, though many in the room did not know his name, something in his bearing, steady and plain-spoken, commanded attention. "If the commission will permit a word from someone who's only been in this county a short while," Peter said, "I'd like to point out something about the proposal Mr. Grady has put forward. Mr. Grady owns 8,000 acres to the south, more cattle than anyone else in this county, and by every account I've heard, he has creeks on his own land that ran dry this summer, same as everyone else's. Now it strikes me as curious that a man with that much land, and that many resources would ride 2 hours out of his way to lean on a widow woman with no husband to speak for her, rather than working out some arrangement of mutual aid among the larger ranchers first, men more able to bear the cost of sharing than a woman working 7 acres alone. I don't know Mr. Grady's mind, and I won't pretend to. But it seems to me that a proposal aimed so precisely at the one homestead in this county with no man to defend it deserves a closer look before this commission votes to take a woman's well away from her by force of law." Silas Grady, seated near the front of the room, had gone red in the face. "I resent the implication, sir. My proposal was made in the interest of the whole county, not aimed at any one landowner." "Then perhaps," Judge Thornton said dryly, "the commission ought to consider a broader proposal, one that calls on all landowners with productive wells or springs, including your own southern range, Mr. Grady, to contribute toward community relief, rather than singling out one homestead by name in the original text." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, and Grady's face grew redder still, though he said nothing further, apparently recognizing that the tide of the room had turned against the narrowness of his original proposal. In the end, after another hour of debate and discussion, the commission voted to table the original proposal entirely, and to accept instead a voluntary framework, much as Charlotte had suggested, in which landowners with surplus water would contribute to a community relief effort organized through the county, with contributions tracked and, where possible, later repaid through communal labor or a share of whatever harvest each contributing family managed to bring in. It was not a perfect solution, and Charlotte knew that hauling water to help her neighbors would mean more labor for her and Peter both, on top of the work already required to bring in her corn harvest. But it was a solution that left her well her own, that let her keep what Thomas had built for her, and that let her be the kind of neighbor she wanted to be, out of choice rather than compulsion. As the meeting broke up and people began filing out of the hot, crowded room, several of the smaller farmers came to thank her, Mr. Aldis among them, his earlier sharpness replaced now with something like shame and gratitude both. "I spoke out of turn earlier, Mrs. Hawkins," he said. "I'm sorry for it. Desperation makes a man say ugly things sometimes. There's no need to apologize, Mr. Aldis. I understand desperation well enough myself. I hope this arrangement helps your family through the winter." Outside in the dusty street of Millbrook, Silas Grady approached Charlotte and Peter one final time, his earlier menace replaced now with something more like grudging respect, though his eyes remained cold. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Mrs. Hawkins, and you too, Mr. Walden, whoever you are. I don't forget being made a fool of in front of the whole county." "I don't believe anyone made a fool of you, Mr. Grady," Peter said evenly. "You did that yourself, riding 2 hours to threaten a widow instead of looking to your own land first. But I'll say this plainly, since you seem to favor plain speaking. If you ever come around Mrs. Hawkins's homestead again with threats in your mouth, you'll find me there, and I won't be nearly so patient a second time." Grady's jaw worked, but he said nothing further, only mounted his horse and rode off toward his ranch to the south. And though he remained a presence in the county for years afterward, he never again troubled Charlotte Hawkins or her land, having learned, perhaps, that some things could not be taken by threat or by vote, only earned through honest dealing, which was a lesson he was apparently too proud or too set in his ways ever fully to learn. The weeks that followed the commission meeting settled into a rhythm that felt, to both Charlotte and Peter, something like the shape of a life beginning to take root. True to Charlotte's word before the commission, they spent long days hauling surplus water in barrels loaded onto Charlotte's wagon, delivering it to the Aldous family and 3 other neighboring homesteads whose wells had gone dry or nearly so, watching gratitude and relief spread across faces that had held nothing but fear and exhaustion for months. It was hard work, made harder by the ongoing demands of Charlotte's own harvest, which was fast approaching. But Peter found that he did not mind the labor at all, found instead that there was a deep satisfaction in it that he had never felt driving another man's cattle across an empty range, a satisfaction that came from watching a community slowly knit itself back together, thread by thread, through small acts of shared sacrifice. In the evenings, when the water hauling was done and the last of the day's chores completed, Charlotte and Peter would walk together through the cornfield, checking the ears for ripeness. And it was during one of these evening walks in the last week of August that Peter finally worked up the courage to say the thing he had been carrying in his chest for weeks. "Charlotte," he said, stopping between 2 rows of tall green stalks, the sun setting behind them in a wash of gold and red that seemed, for once, almost gentle rather than merciless. "I've been thinking on something, and I don't quite know the right way to say it, so I'm just going to say it plain, the way you like things said." Charlotte turned to face him, her heart already beginning to beat faster, some instinct telling her what was coming even before he found the words for it. "I came into this county a drifter," Peter went on. 8 years riding for other men's brands, never staying anywhere long enough to plant so much as a garden, let alone put down roots. I told myself I liked it that way, told myself a man alone doesn't need more than a good horse and an open trail. But I don't believe that anymore, Charlotte. I haven't believed it since the day I rode up on this field and saw the only green thing left in 100 miles of dust, and saw you standing at the edge of it with a hoe in your hands and a shotgun ready, braver than any man I ever rode trail with. Peter, let me finish, please, before I lose my nerve." He took her hands in his own hands roughened by weeks of labor alongside hers, calluses meeting calluses. "I love you, Charlotte Hawkins. I love the way you work this land like it's a piece of your own heart. I love the way you stood up to Sela's Grady without so much as a tremor in your voice, though I know you were afraid. I love the way you looked at those Aldous children when we brought them water, like their relief was worth more to you than gold. I don't have much to offer you, not yet. 11 head of cattle and whatever I can earn from selling them, and 2 strong hands willing to work this land beside you for as long as you'll have me. But I'm asking you, if you'll have me, to marry me, and to let me spend the rest of my life helping you keep this field green and this home standing, for as long as we both shall live." Charlotte felt tears rising in her eyes, tears that came from someplace deeper than sadness, though grief was tangled up in them too, grief for Thomas that she knew would never fully leave her, but that had, over these past weeks, softened into something she could carry alongside this new and unexpected joy rather than something that crowded joy out entirely. "I loved Thomas," she said softly. "I want you to know that before I say anything else. I loved him, and losing him broke something in me that I thought might never mend. I know that, Charlotte. I'd never ask you to forget him or to love him less in your memory. That's not what I'm asking. I know it isn't." She reached up and touched his face, weathered by sun and wind, kind in a way that had crept up on her slowly over these past weeks until it had become, without her quite noticing when, the thing she looked forward to most in each long day. "But I think Thomas would want this for me, Peter. I think he'd want me to be happy again, to have someone standing beside me in this field instead of working it alone. He dug that well not just to save the farm, but because he loved me enough to spend his last strength making sure I'd be provided for after he was gone. I think loving you doesn't dishonor that. I think it might be exactly what he'd have wanted. Is that a yes?" Peter asked, a hopeful, almost boyish smile breaking across his face despite the gravity of the moment. "That's a yes, Peter Walden." Charlotte laughed, a sound bright and clear as it had not been in more than a year, and Peter pulled her close and kissed her there in the cornfield, surrounded by the tall green stalks that had brought them together, while the last light of the sun faded gold and then violet, and then to the deep blue of a Kansas evening. And somewhere far off, for the first time in months, thunder rumbled low and distant on the horizon, though neither of them noticed it yet, too absorbed in each other to pay attention to anything so mundane as weather. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the small white church at the edge of Millbrook, on a Sunday afternoon in mid-September. By then the drought had finally begun to break, the first real rains of the season having fallen just 5 days before, turning the parched brown fields of Larkspur County a tentative green that would, with luck, allow at least a partial recovery of crops before the first frost. It was not enough rain to undo a full summer of suffering, but it was enough to restore hope, and there was a sense throughout the county, as families gathered for Charlotte and Peter's wedding, that they were witnessing not only the marriage of two people who had clearly fallen deeply in love, but also a kind of turning point, a sign that the worst of the hard times might finally be passing. Charlotte wore her mother's dress, the same dark blue calico she had worn to the commission meeting, though she had spent the evenings of the preceding week adding a border of delicate white lace around the collar and cuffs, sewn from fabric traded for at the general store. Peter wore a suit borrowed from Mr. Aldous, who had insisted on the loan as a small repayment for the water that had saved his family's breeding stock through the worst weeks of August. And though the suit did not fit him perfectly, being cut for a somewhat smaller man, Charlotte thought, watching him wait for her at the front of the church, that she had never seen him look finer. The Reverend Josiah Whitfield, who had presided over Millbrook's small congregation for nearly a decade, spoke words that felt, to both Charlotte and Peter, remarkably suited to the circumstances of their meeting and courtship. Though he had chosen them, he later admitted, simply from the standard wedding liturgy, without any particular intention beyond tradition. "We are gathered here," Reverend Whitfield began, "in a season that has tested this whole community sorely, to witness a union that reminds us all that even in the driest and hardest of times, love finds a way to take root and grow, much as this bride's own cornfield stood green through the worst drought this county has known, a testament to labor and faith, and the quiet persistence of hope." Charlotte, standing at the altar with her hand in Peter's, thought of Thomas then, thought of the well he had dug with hands already weakening from the fever that would soon take his life, thought of how he had never lived to see the corn grow tall and green from the water he had found, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek that was equal parts grief and gratitude. Grief for what she had lost and gratitude for what that loss had, in its strange and painful way, made possible. The Aldous children, all 5 of them, sat in the front pew with their mother, scrubbed clean and dressed in their best clothes, watching the ceremony with the particular solemn attention of children who understood, in whatever way children understand such things, that something important was happening. Mr. Aldous himself stood near the back of the church, having offered, in the week since the commission meeting, to help Charlotte and Peter with their harvest in whatever way he could, a debt of gratitude he seemed determined to repay many times over. Even Silas Grady, though he did not attend the wedding himself, sent word through one of his hired hands that he wished the couple well, a gesture that surprised everyone who heard of it, though Peter privately suspected it had more to do with avoiding further embarrassment in front of the county than any genuine change of heart. Whatever the reason, Grady never again troubled Charlotte's homestead, and in time, as the drought fully broke over the following 2 years and the county slowly recovered its prosperity, the animosity between them faded into the kind of distant, wary civility common between neighbors who have clashed once and have no wish to clash again. When Reverend Whitfield pronounced Charlotte Hawkins and Peter Walden husband and wife, the small congregation erupted into applause. And outside the church, as the newly married couple emerged into the September afternoon, someone had strung a banner between two fence posts reading simply, "Congratulations," in hand-painted letters. A gift from the women of the county who had gathered what little spare cloth and paint they could find to mark the occasion properly, drought or no drought. The reception, such as it was, took place in the meeting hall above the general store, the same room where the commission meeting had been held just weeks before, though now filled with a very different kind of energy, tables laden with whatever food the county's recovering larders could provide. Fried chicken, biscuits, a cake made with precious hoarded sugar, and in a gesture that made Charlotte laugh with delighted surprise when she saw it, a large pot of fresh corn on the cob, harvested that very morning from her own field, the first corn any family in Larkspur County had tasted fresh from a Kansas stalk in 3 long years. "Seemed fitting," Peter said, when she asked him about it, revealing that he had arranged the surprise with Mrs. Aldous that morning while Charlotte was busy dressing for the ceremony. "Seeing as that corn is sort of how we met, and sort of how this whole county started pulling itself back together." "It's perfect," Charlotte said, kissing him again in front of the whole gathered assembly, to the cheerful hooting and applause of the assembled guests, most of whom had grown genuinely fond of the young widow and the quiet, steady cowboy who had ridden into her life at the darkest point of that terrible summer, and had, through patience and honest labor and a courage that matched her own, helped her not only save her land but find her way back to joy. The harvest that followed, in the first weeks of October, yielded more corn than Charlotte had dared hope for even in her most optimistic moments, the 7 acres producing enough not only to pay off the remainder of the bank debt Thomas had left behind, but to set aside a healthy surplus of seed corn for the following spring, and to sell a substantial portion at the grain exchange in the county seat at a price made favorable by the general scarcity of corn throughout the drought-stricken region that year. Peter sold his 11 head of cattle as well, at a price better than he had expected given their thinness after the long, hard summer, and combined the proceeds with Charlotte's harvest earnings to purchase 24 more head of breeding stock, laying the foundation for what would, over the coming years, grow into a modest but prosperous cattle operation to complement Charlotte's continued corn farming. They expanded the soddy house that first winter, adding a second room and a proper wood floor salvaged from lumber hauled in from the railhead, a project Peter worked on through the cold months while Charlotte kept the household running, and as it turned out, carried their first child, a fact she discovered with a mixture of joy and nervous wonder in December, and shared with Peter on a snowy evening by the hearth fire, watching his face transform from confusion to disbelief to an overwhelming, tearful happiness that surprised them both with its intensity. "A child," Peter said, his voice thick with emotion, kneeling beside her chair and placing his hand gently over her still flat abdomen as though he could somehow feel the new life growing there already. "Charlotte, I never thought after all those years alone on the trail that I'd have this, a wife, a home, now a child coming." "Neither did I," Charlotte admitted, "not after Thomas died. I thought that part of my life was finished, that I'd spend the rest of my years working this land alone, with nothing but memories for company. I'm glad I was wrong. I'm glad, too." He kissed her softly, then rested his forehead against hers, both of them silent for a long moment, simply savoring the warmth of the fire and the weight of the future opening up before them, uncertain in its particulars but rich, now, with hope in a way that neither of them could have imagined during that terrible, dust-choked summer just past. The child, a son, was born the following July, exactly 1 year after Peter had first ridden up on Charlotte's cornfield, a timing that struck them both as a kind of quiet blessing when they realized it, and they named him Thomas Peter Walden, honoring both the husband Charlotte had lost and the husband she had found, a name that Peter suggested himself, without any hint of jealousy or reservation. Understanding instinctively that Thomas Hawkins's memory was woven into the very foundation of the life he and Charlotte were building together, inseparable from the well that had saved the farm, inseparable from the woman Charlotte had become through grief and hardship before Peter had ever known. Sorry. 2 years after that, a daughter followed, whom they named Eleanor after Charlotte's mother, and by then Larkspur County had fully recovered from the great drought of 1878, the rains having returned in reliable measure, the fields around Millbrook green once more with corn and wheat and sorghum, the desperate scarcity of that terrible summer receding into memory, and eventually into the kind of story told at gatherings and church socials. A story about the year the widow Hawkins's cornfield stood alone and green against a county of dust, and about the drifting cowboy who had ridden up out of the heat shimmer one desperate afternoon and never left again. Charlotte and Peter's homestead grew over the following years into one of the most prosperous small farms and ranches in the county. The original 160 acres expanded through careful purchase and hard work to nearly 400. The herd grown from those original 24 head of breeding stock to a respectable operation numbering in the hundreds. The cornfield itself expanded season by season until it stretched across nearly 30 acres. Still fed in part by the deep well Thomas Hawkins had dug in the last months of his life, though now supplemented by additional wells Peter dug himself in the years that followed, ensuring that never again would the farm's fortunes depend so entirely on a single source of water. They raised their children, Thomas and Eleanor, and eventually 3 more who followed in the years after, teaching them the same values that had brought their parents together in the first place: hard work, honest dealing, and a generosity of spirit that did not wait for prosperity before extending kindness to others. Charlotte often told her children the story of the drought summer, of the commission meeting where she had stood up to Silas Grady, of the water hauled to neighboring farms even when her own family's needs pressed heavily upon her. And she told them, too, of their father Peter's arrival, riding up out of a heat-shattered horizon with 11 starving cattle, and a heart that had, without either of them quite realizing it at the time, already begun to fall in love with the woman and the land he found there. Silas Grady, in the years that followed, gradually mellowed in his old age, his ranch continuing to prosper though never again through the kind of aggressive tactics he had attempted against Charlotte during the drought summer. He and Peter maintained a distant but civil relationship as neighboring landowners, occasionally cooperating on matters of mutual interest such as railroad shipping rates for cattle, though the 2 men never became close friends, the memory of that tense confrontation in Charlotte's cornfield remaining, for both of them, a marker of a boundary that had been drawn and would not be crossed again. Mr. Aldous and his family became close friends of the Waldens over the years, their children growing up alongside Thomas and Eleanor and their siblings, the 2 families sharing labor at harvest time and celebrating holidays together, a bond forged in the shared hardship of that terrible drought summer and strengthened by years of subsequent friendship and mutual support, the kind of deep community connection that had, in many ways, been born out of the very crisis that had once threatened to tear the county's fragile social fabric apart. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, in September of 1888, Charlotte and Peter walked together through the cornfield in the evening light, much as they had on the evening Peter first proposed, their 5 children scattered around the property engaged in various evening chores and games, the farm having grown into exactly the kind of prosperous, deeply rooted home that neither of them could have imagined during that desperate summer a decade before. "Do you ever think about it?" Charlotte asked, taking Peter's weathered hand in her own, both of them older now, lines earned through years of sun and labor and love etched into their faces, though the warmth between them had only deepened with time rather than fading. "About how close we came to never meeting at all. If you'd taken a different trail north, if I'd sold this land after Thomas died like everyone expected me to. I think about it sometimes, Peter admitted, looking out over the vast green field, so much larger now than it had been that first summer, but still in his heart, the same field that had drawn him in with its improbable, defiant green against a landscape of dust and despair. But I don't dwell on it much. I figure some things are just meant to happen, Charlotte. A man doesn't ride 200 miles of dry trail and just happen upon the one green field in 100 miles, tended by the one woman brave and stubborn enough to keep it alive against every hardship the land could throw at her, without something guiding him there. Call it fate, call it providence, call it whatever you like. I just know I'm grateful for it every single day. So am I. Charlotte leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors it had painted the evening he first proposed. Thomas gave me this well, this land, this chance at a future when everything else seemed lost. But you, Peter Walden, you gave me my life back. You taught me that love doesn't run out, same as kindness doesn't run out, not even in the driest, hardest seasons a person can face. We built this together, Peter said softly. Every bit of it. The well was Thomas's gift, but everything that's grown from it since, this family, this farm, this life, that's ours, Charlotte. Yours and mine, built the same way we built that first fence together, one post at a time, with hard work and faith that the effort would be worth it in the end. They stood together in the cornfield as the sun set, the tall green stalks rustling softly in the evening breeze, their children's laughter carrying across the yard from where they played near the barn. And Charlotte thought that this, finally, was what her mother had meant all those years ago, about kindness being the one thing that never ran dry, even in the hardest of droughts. It had carried her through her darkest grief, drawn a good man to her door when she needed him most, and grown, over a decade of shared labor and love, into a life richer and fuller than she had ever dared imagine possible during those long, desperate months of dust and loss. The cornfield that had once stood alone as the only green thing in a county gone brown with drought had, by the 10th anniversary of Charlotte and Peter's wedding, become simply one green field among many, the county having long since recovered its fertility and its hope, the rains having returned as they always eventually did on the Kansas plains, the desperate summer of 1878 receding into local legend. Told and retold at church socials and family gatherings as an example of how a community, and two people brave enough to open their hearts to each other despite grief and hardship, could weather even the harshest of seasons and emerge, in the end, stronger and more deeply rooted than before. Charlotte Hawkins Walden and Peter Walden lived out the remainder of their long lives on that same homestead, watching their 5 children grow to adulthood, marry, and eventually bring grandchildren to visit the farm that had, in its own quiet way, been built on a foundation of water and love and the stubborn, unshakable belief that even in the driest and most desperate of times, something green and living could take root and flourish, if only someone were brave enough and patient enough and loving enough to tend it. And every September, on the anniversary of their wedding, Peter would walk with Charlotte through whatever section of the cornfield stood closest to ripening, and he would tell her, as he had told her every year since that first proposal beneath the tall green stalks, that she remained the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman he had ever known, and that riding up on her cornfield that dusty summer afternoon had been the finest stroke of fortune in a life that had, before that moment, known far more hardship than blessing. And Charlotte would tell him, in turn, that he had been the answer to a prayer she had not even known she was praying, a man who had seen her not as a widow to be pitied or a homestead to be exploited, but as a woman worth loving fully and completely, worth standing beside against any threat, worth building an entire lifetime with, one green and growing season at a time. Their love story became, in time, one of the enduring tales of Larkspur County, told to newcomers who settled in the area in the years that followed, A reminder that even the harshest droughts eventually broke, that even the most desperate circumstances could give rise to the deepest and most enduring kinds of love, and that sometimes the very thing that seemed most like a curse, a summer of merciless drought that had driven away so many families and broken so many hopes, could become instead the occasion for the greatest blessing a person might ever receive, a love strong enough and true enough to grow green and lasting against every hardship the world could throw in its path.